Frank Harrison, a 68-year-old Army veteran, owned 40 acres in Meadowbrook, Virginia, where he farmed with a military-owned John Deere tractor, earned through a veterans program. Cynthia Davenport, the new HOA president of neighboring Willow Creek Estates, targeted the tractor as an eyesore, despite Frank's land being outside her jurisdiction. She sent letters, filed complaints, and surveilled his property, escalating tensions. While Frank was away, she had the tractor towed, unaware it was federal property, triggering a legal firestorm. Frank alerted the Department of Defense, and military officials, including JAG officers and MPs, intervened, halting the impound and confronting Cynthia with evidence of her crimes: trespassing, theft of government property, and fraud. Her face paled as her authority crumbled. She resigned from the HOA, settled to avoid prosecution, and fled the community. The incident sparked an HOA uprising, with residents ousting her allies and embracing Frank's farm as a heritage asset. New leadership established balanced rules, and his educational programs expanded, earning a community award. Frank's tractor, restored and boldly marked, became a symbol of resilience, proving that standing firm could transform a community and bury a tyrant's ambitions. The sun hung low over the rolling fields of Meadowbrook, Virginia, casting a golden haze across 40 acres of fertile soil that Frank Harrison had fought for, not with bullets, but with sweat, grit, and 30 years of unyielding service in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. At 68, Frank stood tall, his weathered hands gripping the edge of a dream he'd clawed from the jaws of a world that too often forgot its veterans. This wasn't just land. It was his redemption, his sanctuary, a heartbeat pulsing through every furrow he'd plowed, every fence post he'd driven into the earth. Beside him stood Martha, his wife of 42 years, her quiet strength a steady anchor in the storm of his restless soul. Together they'd built a life here, a modest two-bedroom farmhouse, dwarfed by the vastness of their hard-won paradise, a converted barn workshop humming with purpose 300 yards away. But the crown jewel of this kingdom wasn't the land itself. It was the John Deere 5075E utility tractor, a military-grade beast that roared with the weight of history. Frank's chest swelled with pride every time he laid eyes on it, its green paint gleaming like a medal pinned to his soul. Earned through the Department of Defense's Veteran Equipment Preservation Program, it wasn't just a tool. It was a testament to his sacrifice, a living relic of a nation that owed him more than it could ever repay. The paperwork had been a battle in itself: endless forms, signatures in triplicate, inspections that felt like interrogations. But he'd conquered it all, just as he'd conquered deserts and jungles in his youth. This tractor was his, yet not his. It bore the seal of the United States government, a sacred trust he'd sworn to uphold. Every quarter he'd throw open the gates of his farm to wide-eyed schoolchildren, their laughter echoing across the fields as they clambered over the machine, learning about farming, engineering, and the military's unyielding spirit. Frank's voice would crack with emotion as he told them stories of courage, of soil turned by calloused hands, of a country worth fighting for. Major Williams, the DoD rep, had clapped him on the shoulder during the last visit, his words ringing in Frank's ears. "You're doing good work here, Frank. Something special." Those words were fuel, igniting a fire in his chest that no years of weariness could extinguish. This was his American dream, carved from the dust of a life spent serving others. But as the shadow of encroaching developers loomed on the horizon, and the pristine lawns of Willow Creek Estates crept closer, Frank felt a tremor of unease ripple through his bones. The peace he'd fought for was fragile, and deep down, he knew the storm was coming. A storm dressed in a designer's suit, wielding power she didn't understand, threatening to rip his dream from his hands. The air crackled with tension as Cynthia Davenport swept into Willow Creek Estates like a hurricane in high heels, her white Range Rover slicing through the rural stillness of Meadowbrook like a blade. At 55, she was a former pharmaceutical titan, her golden parachute from a corporate merger dangling over her like a crown she'd forged from ambition and arrogance. To Frank, she was a predator in a navy blue suit, her eyes glinting with the cold determination of someone who'd never known. The sting of dirt under her nails. She'd set her sights on the HOA presidency, and with 32 measly votes, she'd seized it. Her campaign sign screaming, "Premium aesthetic standards," like a war cry against everything Frank held dear. From her gleaming mansion, the biggest, in the neighborhood, she glared across the property line at Frank's farm, her lip curling at the sight of his John Deere tractor. To her, it wasn't a symbol of honor or heritage. It was an eyesore, a green monstrosity daring to sully her vision of suburban perfection. Frank's heart pounded with fury as he read her first memo, its golden embossed logo dripping with pretension, declaring his tractor and his way of life a threat to property values. His land wasn't even part of her HOA. Jim Donaldson, his real estate agent, had made that crystal clear, waving the grandfathered zoning laws like a shield. But Cynthia didn't care about laws. She cared about power, and she decided Frank's dream was her enemy. Martha's voice trembled with exasperation as she tossed the memo onto the kitchen table. "Another city slicker who wants the country without the country," she muttered, her hands clenched into fists. Frank's jaw tightened, his pulse racing as he imagined Cynthia's manicured fingers typing out her edicts, her smug certainty that she could bend this land, and him to her will. He'd faced tyrants before, in uniform and out. But this was personal. This was his home, his legacy, and she was coming for it with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Cynthia's crusade wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a declaration of war. She wanted to erase the rural soul of Meadowbrook, to pave over its history with cookie-cutter lawns and HOA fines. Frank's tractor, with its government tags and military pedigree, stood in her way, a defiant reminder of a world she couldn't control. His blood boiled as he pictured her strutting through Willow Creek, rallying her minions with promises of inflated property values, oblivious to the lives she was trampling. He'd invited her for coffee, laid out his zoning papers, even offered her a front-row seat to his educational program, but her tight smile and clipped words told him everything. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to conquer. And as her shadow loomed larger, Frank felt the ground beneath him quake, knowing this was only the beginning of a fight that would test every ounce of his resolve. The first certified letter hit Frank's mailbox like a gunshot, its crisp envelope a stark white insult against the worn wood of his rural sanctuary. Cynthia Davenport's words leaped off the page, each sentence a dagger aimed at his heart. Derelict machinery, non-conforming equipment, aesthetic violations. Frank's hands shook with rage as he read her demands to remove his John Deere tractor, the same tractor he'd earned with decades of service, the same one that bore the United States government's seal. She didn't just want it gone, she wanted him broken. His chest tightened, a storm of indignation brewing as he pictured her in her pristine office, pen slashing across paper, oblivious to the history she was trying to erase. He fired back with copies of his zoning docs, property surveys, and a calm explanation of the tractor's military significance, his pen digging into the paper as if it could carve his defiance into her soul. But Cynthia was relentless. The letters kept coming, weekly now, each one more formal, more threatening, until the third arrived on letterhead from Winston and Leeds, attorneys at law. Frank's stomach dropped, his breath catching as he realized she'd escalated to legal warfare. Later, he'd learn it was just her brother-in-law's firm, a petty flex of borrowed power, but in that moment, It felt like a guillotine hovering over his neck. When that failed, she pivoted to noise complaints, her sanctimonious voice echoing through the county office as she whined about his 7 a.m. tractor work, disrupting her precious, residential quiet hours. Frank's fists clenched, his vision blurring with fury. This was his land, his rhythm. Sunrise starts were the heartbeat of farming, and she dared call it a nuisance? Then came the surveillance. Every morning at 8:15 sharp, her Range Rover prowled the dirt access road, a gleaming predator stalking its prey. Through his kitchen window, Frank watched her snap photos, her leather-bound notebook clutched like a weapon, documenting his every move. His pulse thundered in his ears, a primal roar building in his throat as he realized she wouldn't stop until she'd crushed him. But Frank wasn't defenseless. He'd faced worse than Cynthia: desert sandstorms, enemy fire, bureaucrats with clipboards, and he'd survived it all. He'd invited her into his home, shown her the papers, even offered her a glimpse of the kids climbing on the tractor during his quarterly event. For a fleeting moment, he'd thought he'd won. Neighbors praised his farm. Dr. James Harris lauded its heritage, but Cynthia's smile had tightened into a razor's edge. Quaint, she'd sneered, her eyes locked on the tractor like it was a personal affront. That green monstrosity has to go. Frank's blood ran hot, his voice steady but laced with steel as he reminded her, "Not your rules to enforce, ma'am." She'd smirked, a predator sizing up her kill, and as she strode away, Frank knew this was no truce. It was a declaration that her war was far from over. The betrayal struck like lightning on a clear day. Frank and Martha had been gone just 4 days, cradling their newborn grandchild, their hearts swollen with joy when they returned to a scene that turned Frank's blood to ice. The dirt access road stretched before them, and where his John Deere tractor once stood, proud, green, unyielding, was nothing but an empty scar in the earth. "Someone stole it," he growled, his voice cracking with disbelief as he fumbled for his phone, fingers trembling with a fury he hadn't felt since his combat days. Sheriff Cooper's number was halfway dialed when Martha's shout pierced the air. "Frank, there's an envelope on the door." His boots pounded the porch steps, dread coiling in his gut as he ripped open the HOA letterhead. Cynthia Davenport's signature sprawled across the bottom in smug blue ink, her words a taunting slap. Notice of nuisance abatement action. Equipment removed. Contact Hillside Impound. Frank's vision blurred, rage exploding in his ears. Chest like a grenade. She'd done it. She'd crossed the line, trespassed onto his land, and stolen his tractor. His hand shook as he called the impound lot, the attendant's casual tone. Lady in a blue suit signed the papers. $1,200 towing fee, $150 a day storage, fueling the inferno in his soul. Then his phone buzzed. Cynthia herself, her voice dripping with venomous glee. "The community entrance looks so much better already," she purred, and Frank's grip tightened, knuckles white, as she demanded fees and a signed surrender to X. Keep his eyesore off the road. "That tractor isn't just my property," he roared, his voice a thunderclap. "It belongs to the United States military." She cut him off. "It's gone, Mr. Harrison," and hung up, leaving him, reeling in a silence that screamed injustice. His mind raced, the government tags flashing in his memory. Property of U.S. government, unauthorized removal prohibited. This wasn't theft. It was a federal crime, and Cynthia had no idea the hell she'd unleashed. His heart pounded, a drumbeat of vengeance, as he dialed Major Williams, expecting a voicemail but getting a live voice instead. "Frank, everything all right?" Williams asked, and Frank's words tumbled out, raw and jagged, recounting the theft, the footage of Cynthia's trespass, the impound notice. "Stay put," Williams barked, his tone sharp with authority. "Document everything. Photos, boundaries. Don't call her back. I'm making calls. Frank's breath hitched, a surge of hope battling the fury in his veins. He grabbed his camera, snapping shots of the empty spot. The fence post she'd dared claim as hers, his hands steadying with purpose. Cynthia thought she'd won, thought she'd humiliated him, but she'd misjudged the man she'd crossed. This wasn't just about a tractor anymore. It was about honor, about rights, about a fight she couldn't fathom. As the sun dipped, below the horizon, Frank stood on his land, eyes blazing, knowing the storm he'd summoned was about to break her world apart. The dawn broke with a vengeance, and Frank's heart thundered as a convoy of government vehicles tore down his dirt driveway, kicking up dust like a war party charging into battle. A sleek SUV led the charge, flanked by two military police cars, their lights slicing through the morning haze, and a civilian sedan trailing like a silent judge. Major Williams stepped out first, his face etched with a mix of sympathy and steel, and introduced Captain Sarah Jensen from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, a woman whose calm authority made the air crackle with consequence. Behind her, two MPs loomed, their presence a quiet threat, and Mr. Terence Blackwell from the Department of Transportation adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the scene with cold precision. Frank's pulse raced as they swarmed his property, their questions sharp and relentless, peeling back the layers of Cynthia's crime. They pored over his security footage, grainy images of her in that damned navy suit, ducking under his fence, each frame a nail in her coffin. His voice shook with righteous fury as he handed over the impound notice, the HOA's smug letterhead now a smoking gun. Captain Jensen's eyes narrowed, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. This isn't just about your tractor, Mr. Harrison. Unauthorized removal of marked government equipment triggers federal statutes, multiple jurisdictions. Frank's chest swelled, a wildfire of vindication roaring through him as Blackwell nodded gravely. They used a commercial tow truck on public roads without permits. That's a separate violation, he said, his voice low and lethal. Major Williams stepped aside, phone pressed to his ear, and when he returned, his expression was a storm cloud ready to burst. 6 years running this program, Frank. Vandalism. Theft attempts, but never this. She's kicked a hornet's nest, he said, shaking his head. Frank's breath caught, adrenaline surging as Jensen outlined the plan. We've halted the impound. The DOD's redirecting the truck back here. The words hit like a thunderbolt. His tractor was coming home, and Cynthia's reckoning was barreling toward her. She'll show up soon, Williams warned, a glint of anticipation in his eyes, and Frank felt the ground shift beneath him, a seismic promise of justice. As the military officials wrapped up, Frank's mind raced, replaying Cynthia's smug voice, her casual dismissal of his rights. She'd thought him a pushover, an old farmer she could bully into submission. But she'd miscalculated. This wasn't just his fight now. It was the might of the U.S. government, a machine of law and order she couldn't outrun. His hands, clenched nails digging into his palms, as he pictured her Range Rover screeching up, her world crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance. The air hummed with tension, the promise of confrontation electrifying every nerve. Frank stood taller, his cowboy hat shadowing eyes that burned with resolve, ready to face the storm she'd unleashed and watch it swallow her whole. The dirt access road trembled as the flatbed tow truck roared into Frank's driveway, his John Deere tractor gleaming defiantly atop it. A warrior reclaimed from the jaws of defeat. Frank's heart slammed against his ribs as he pulled up, dust swirling like a battle cry, only to see Cynthia's white Range Rover skid to a halt behind him. She erupted from the vehicle, navy suit, pristine, heels wobbling on the uneven ground, her designer handbag swinging like a weapon. Her eyes blazed with indignation, but Frank stepped forward, cowboy hat tipped low, overalls streaked with the earth she despised, and pointed a finger that trembled with righteous fury. "That eyesore you towed belongs to the United States military, ma'am," he thundered, his voice a cannon shot that stopped her cold. The military convoy flanked the scene. Major Williams, Captain Jensen, the MPs, Blackwell, each a pillar of authority dwarfing her petty reign. Cynthia marched toward the tow truck, her voice shrill with disbelief. "I authorized that to impound, not back here." But Jensen intercepted, her tone ice-cold and unyielding. "Miss Davenport, I'm Captain Sarah Jensen, JAG Corps. You've committed federal offenses, false authority, theft of government property, interference with a federal program." Frank's blood surged, a tidal wave of triumph crashing through him as Cynthia's face flickered, confusion warring with arrogance. "That old tractor?" she spat, but the tow driver, pale and stammering, cut in. "She told me it was abandoned, signed everything." Blackwell thrust a photo of the tractor's government plate into her hands, the eagle seal glaring back at her, and Frank watched her complexion drain to ash. "Federal law supersedes your HOA covenants," Blackwell snapped, and Major Williams played the damning security footage, Cynthia's own voice echoing. "Take it to your furthest storage area. Process it as abandoned." Her hands shook as Jensen handed her a cease and desist letter, her empire crumbling with every word. "Expect contact from our office. This investigation's just beginning." Frank's chest heaved, a victorious roar trapped in his throat as she muttered, "This isn't over," and retreated to her Range Rover, tires spinning in defeat. The tow driver approached, voice low, with regret. "Sir, I didn't know. I'm returning it instead of impound." Frank nodded, his pulse still hammering, as Cynthia's taillights vanished. By nightfall, the community buzzed. Neighbors like the Garsons and Mitchells arrived, with pie and wine, their voices thick with awe and gratitude. Judge Robert Chun called, his tone urgent. "This HOA's out of control. I'm organizing a meeting." Frank's heart swelled, the fifth victory sinking in. Cynthia was gone, her resignation a white flag waved in the dark. She'd listed her house, fleeing to a condo with stricter rules, ironic justice that made Frank's lips twitch with grim satisfaction. He stood on his porch, the night air electric with change, knowing her downfall was his triumph, a battle won not just for him, but for every soul she'd tried to crush. The Willow Creek clubhouse pulsed with raw energy as over 90% of its residents crammed inside, their voices a rising tide of fury and hope. Frank sat in the back, his heart pounding like a war drum, as the emergency HOA meeting stretched from 1 hour to 3, a dam bursting after years of silent suffering. Cynthia's absence was a gaping wound, her resignation letter citing health concerns had landed like a grenade an hour before. But no one mourned her. Judge Robert Chun's voice boomed, steady and commanding, as he read it aloud, and the room erupted in applause that shook the walls, a cathartic roar that sent chills down Frank's spine. This was victory number 6, and it tasted like fire and freedom. Residents spilled their stories, intimidation, fines for wildflowers, basketball hoops, each tale a lash against Cynthia's reign of terror. Frank's chest tightened, pride and rage colliding. As Walter Phillips, the treasurer, dropped the bombshell, Cynthia had siphoned HOA funds for her vendettas, paying Hillside Impound without approval, logging it as beautification. The spreadsheet glowed on the wall, a guilty verdict in black and white, and gasps rippled through the crowd. Frank's fists clenched, imagining her smug face as she'd signed those checks, oblivious to the reckoning she'd sown. Judge Chun called it governance overreach, his words a gavel slamming down, and the committee heads she'd handpicked squirmed, their power evaporating under the weight of truth. The interim board, led by Chun, struck fast, suspending fines, setting boundaries, launching a forensic audit. and Frank watched, breathless, as his fight reshaped a community. Then came the unexpected. Margaret Turner, a retired principal, approached, her eyes alight with purpose. "We moved here for the rural soul," she said, pleading for more of his educational programs. 3 residents volunteered: a teacher, a gardener, an historian, and Judge Chun greenlit a community garden, a defiant stand against Cynthia's sterile vision. Frank's throat tightened, emotion clawing at him as the board invited him to advise a heritage committee, a 7th victory that hit like a thunderclap. His farm, once her target, was now their inspiration. Major Williams called days later, his voice crackling with triumph. "Cynthia settled, no prosecution, but a hefty payout for our program. Your tractor's back next week, fully serviced." Frank's heart soared, picturing her signing that admission. Her pride shattered. Willow Creek transformed. Monthly events bloomed. Dr. Harris taught history, kids planted vegetables, and 6 months later, a regional community planning award crowned their efforts. Frank's tractor immortalized in the clubhouse plaque. His breath caught, tears pricking his eyes, as veterans gathered twice yearly on his land, their stories weaving a tapestry of shared pride. This wasn't just his win. It was theirs, a community reborn from the ashes of her tyranny. Its roots sinking deeper because he'd stood firm. Frank gazed at his restored John Deere, its new stencil a bold warning, and felt the earth steady beneath him, a legacy secured in the fire of that fight.